We do just want to let you know that we will be talking about some very mature themes in this episode.
She's gonna set your house on fire. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Book Isn't Necessarily Better, a podcast put on by the Community Library Network in North Idaho. I'm your host, Mikayla.
And I'm Roxanne with an E.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a very special guest with us today. Welcome, Kristi.
Hello.
Kristi, what do you do here?
I am the communications coordinator for the Community Library Network.
What does a communications coordinator do?
Yes, so I do press releases, events. I run our social media and oversee our website, among other things, and also internal communication for all 8 libraries.
Sounds like a pretty important job. Very cool.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, it is very cool, but I don't think of it as like, yeah.
Well, we think you're cool. We're excited to have you on the podcast today. And this is a book/film that you brought up to us, one of your favorites, right? What are we talking about today?
Yes, today we will be covering Anne of Green Gables.
Yay!
Yay or boo. Depends on who you are.
We are not kindred spirits,
no,
are we?
We are different people.
We are very different people. Well, we're going to talk about Anne of Green Gables, which is a book from 1908, written by L.M. Montgomery, Lucy Maud Montgomery, and she was very clear that she wanted to be Maud without an E. And woo, this lady had a life. Alright, so we decided that we should name this segment Roxanne's History Corner, since I love doing the bios of authors at the beginning. So Lucy Maud Montgomery was born in 1874 on Prince Edward Island in eastern Canada. So basically, if you look at a map, there's Maine, in the United States, and then if you cross the border over to New Brunswick, off of New Brunswick, there's an island, Prince Edward Island. And she has made this island famous. Just 2 years after she was born, her mom died of tuberculosis when she was a baby, and her dad basically sent her to live with her grandparents and then peaced out. He got remarried, he moved to Saskatchewan. We'll learn in Anne of Green Gables, she has these lovely caretakers named Matthew and Marilla who have tough exteriors but hearts of gold, and that was not the case with Lucy's grandma and grandpa. They were pretty much strict. They didn't understand this weird little theater kid they had entrusted to them, and she knew from the very beginning that she was going to be a writer. She would often say things like that she knew that one day she was going to be famous and all her classmates would remember her when. Like I said, she had a dark beginning. Her earliest memory is seeing her mother dead in her coffin and touching her face. Yeah. And then there's a weird anecdote later. She was in a church service and she asked her aunt where her dead mother was. And her aunt, pointed up towards heaven. And Lucy looked up. She was like, oh, if she's in the trap door in the attic of the church, why don't we just get her down from there? I'm like, oh my god, that's dark. And I've been calling her Lucy. That's not right. I should be calling her Maud without an E. And I want to say that I got a lot of my information from mentalfloss.com. They have really great fun facts about Lucy Maud Montgomery. Some Wikipedia in there, a little bit. But we have a lot of great resources at the library that we'll tell you about later.
And not only great resources at the library, but actually there's an entire school for the scholarship of Lucy Maud Montgomery, the University of Prince Edward Island, at their L.M. Montgomery Institute.
Cool.
So you can find a lot of information about her there as well.
So, like I said, she had to kind of hide her writing from her family. They didn't think it was important or good. Basically dream killers. So she would even sneak candles into her bedroom at night so she could write privately.
Yeah, who didn't do that?
What?
I was like, who didn't do that as a kid?
I was like, I don't know. who did do that?
It's like when you're a kid and you sneak the little flashlight under the covers to read.
Yes.
Yeah.
I actually wanted glasses so bad that I would read in bad light. And that backfired because I have -10 prescription now.
Yeah, me too.
That must be a thing, because when I was a kid, elementary school, second grade, I faked it at the eye doctor because I wanted glasses so bad. Yes. And I had these round, and they were rainbow colored on the frames. And I finally, after I got them, had to admit to my parents that I didn't actually need them, and I couldn't see with them on, and they were quite bad.
Awesome.
Oh my god. Yeah, you were probably getting like headaches too then.
Yeah. And I didn't actually get glasses for real until college, so.
That's hilarious.
I don't know what came over me.
Well, they're cool.
Something Anne would do for sure.
Yeah. Just to be dramatic or like center of attention or something.
Mm-hmm. So she loved writing from a young age. She had a big imagination. She said she had a very lonely childhood. She kept journals her whole life, but like a lot of her journals, we don't know if she was like writing them to be read later. So we don't know if she exaggerated parts of her childhood or how lonely of a childhood it was, but
it's a little bit performance-y.
Yes. So she like never wrote anything down she wouldn't want to be read by the public later. So
including the last note, which I think is really interesting.
I know. Oh, we'll get to it.
We'll get there.
So she earned a teaching degree, and she also studied literature at Dalhousie in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And she did start teaching for a while. Like Stephen King, an earlier episode we did, she didn't like teaching, but it gave her time to write. And her first short stories were published in 1897. She eventually got a job working as like a reporter, kind of, for the Daily Echo in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was the only woman on staff. She totally loved it, but when her grandfather died, she had to return to the town of Cavendish, which is later the model for Avonlea, and she had to take care of her grandmother. Now to the fun stuff. She was a big flirt, and she usually had like a couple of boyfriends at a time. She had this big love of her life. His name was Herman Laird. He wasn't necessarily like her intellectual equal, but it sounds like they had a really spicy love life, even though he was engaged to another woman.
And she was technically engaged to another man.
Mm-hmm.
Scandalous.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. She wrote that he was a very nice, attractive young animal with magnetic blue eyes.
Oh, my.
And there's like a whole bunch of writing about kissing, but I'm too shy to read that. Unfortunately, he died from the flu in 1897, and basically her whole life she went through it that he was the love of her life that got away. But she did get married to a man named Ewan MacDonald, who was a Presbyterian minister, and they had gotten engaged when she was about 32, but they had to keep it secret for 5 years until her grandmother died. I'm not quite sure what the story is behind that, but she realized at her wedding feast that she regretted it, and would regret it the rest of her life. So Ewan had what they called religious melancholy. Basically, he was a super depressive. He was convinced that God had determined he was not chosen to go to heaven, and he basically was severely mentally ill. He would stare into space for long periods of time. She wrote, he would stare at the wall for hours, quote, hair bristling, blue underlip hanging, eyes glaring, face livid. So he was convinced that God condemned him to hell, even though he was a minister, and that his family was going to hell. And Maud had to keep this secret from everyone, even her children. So you can imagine what kind of pressure that was, because as a minister, he could lose his job if they knew that he was having these kind of feelings. But yeah, they had a really horrible marriage. Like, she caught the Spanish flu in 1918, and she almost died from it. He didn't even seem to care that she was dying. Her best friend did die.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She also had 3 sons, one who was stillborn, and it sounds like her eldest son gave her a lot of trouble. So she almost divorced her husband after he didn't care that she almost died from the Spanish flu. But it was extremely hard to get divorces in those days, and it just would not have been socially acceptable. But she wrote that she couldn't stand looking at his face when he had that horrible imbecile expression on his face.
Wow.
Yeah, she hated him. So a lot of her family described her as being really jolly and fun, but this was absolutely a mask. She suffered from her own depressive episodes that only got worse as she got older. So during this time, she wrote Anne of Green Gables in 1905. She couldn't get it published anywhere. She put it in a hat box in her closet, and then she sort of got reinvigorated in 1908, and she was finally able to get it published from a United States publisher. And it was an immediate runaway smash hit. So she became pretty much an instant celebrity, but she said things to the effect that, like, it's too bad I found out that money doesn't buy happiness. She was really successful, very dramatic, but she did become addicted to barbiturates. So before we come to the really sad part of her life, Mikayla, she had some legal issues as well.
She did. I find this really fascinating. She sold to the publisher L.C. Page in the United States, and originally he was supposed to pay her 19 cents of royalties per book sold. He only paid her 7 cents for the first, 13 or 14 years that all of these books were coming out. So he cheated her out of thousands and thousands of dollars, which she didn't know about for a long time. And also, when she did find out and was pursuing him in legal battles, he sold the rights to one of the Anne sequels without actually owning them. So he just gave them to what I thought was hilarious, the disreputable publishers Grosset and Dunlap. And I think that's funny because they're the ones who published Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys.
Oh, really?
And all of the the juvenile novels of the day. But yeah, several people characterize them as disreputable, which I thought was interesting. So she also sued them for having those rights despite L.C. Page not owning them. She finally won this legal battle. It was protracted. It took a really long time. And the court said, okay, you won. He's going to pay you money. His brother subsequently died, and he blamed Maud for causing his brother's death, and basically said, I'm not going to pay you because you killed my brother.
What?
So, a lot of drama queens in this,
Seems
this kitchen.
Bit of a stretch.
Yeah, definitely. And he did eventually end up paying her $15,000 US as a settlement.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But very, very weird.
That is very weird. It also probably took a long time because she's Canadian, probably working in the U.S. legal system.
Yes. Well, and he also protracted it because he knew that he had a lot of money and she didn't, and he thought he could just, out-money her legal troubles by just outlasting her.
Right.
So,
Cool.
Way to go, L.C.
Cool guy
Page.
move.
Yeah, stand-up guy.
Yep.
Yeah, so she had to deal with that, and her depression only got worse as she got older. She had a mental breakdown and nervous breakdown in 1940. She believed that much of her troubles and migraine headaches were from, quote, suppressed romantic passions and her old lover's ghost haunting her.
Excellent.
Yes. Very Mary Shelley of her.
Very.
And so she died at the age of 67. And this is where it gets a little interesting. We don't know. She died of a drug overdose. But it's unclear if this was intentional or not. So do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so her official cause of death is listed as coronary thrombosis, which I believe can be brought about by overdosing. And again, they don't know if it's on purpose or not, but there was a note found in her room that basically told how depressed she was and how nobody knew the struggles she was facing.
Yeah, the piece of paper that was found by her son, Dr. Stuart MacDonald, said, "May God forgive me, and I hope everyone else will forgive me, even if they cannot understand. My position is too awful to endure, and nobody realizes it."
Right. So it's not clear if that was supposed to be part of her journal, if that was an actual note to people, if it was, again, her kind of performing a little bit extra. It's a very strange circumstance.
Mm-hmm. It was written 2 days before she died as well. So I don't know. They're still wrestling with this. I want to give a shout out to a podcast that just came out a few days ago. Maud, Books, Babes, and Barbiturates.
Ooh.
Oh my gosh,
yes,
so good.
Yes, just came out. I listened to the first episode, so big shout out to them. You should go check it out. It's two friends who are doing a 6-part series on Maud's life, and they also are going to dive into this note question.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's her life. It was a long and strange one, and it's crazy to hear about all the troubles she had when you consider the wonderful books she wrote. In all, she published 20 novels, 500 short stories, 30 essays, an autobiography, and a book of poetry.
Prolific.
And today we're focusing on Anne of Green Gables, published in 1908. And Kristi, do you want to give us a brief synopsis?
Sure. So, Anne of Green Gables is centered around a coming-of-age story of an orphan girl named Anne Shirley, who was 11 years old at the start of the book. And she is sent to live in the fictional town of Avonlea with elderly siblings Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert. However, when Matthew goes to the train to pick up the orphan that they had
Mail order.
Yeah, ordered. yeah, it's such a weird thing. It turns out that there was some confusion, and they had originally asked for a boy, but it got mixed up in translation, and there was only Anne. So Matthew, not knowing what to do, and a very quiet and shy man, took her home to where he and Marilla lived, which they called Green Gables. And this is on Prince Edward Island. I think everybody might know that, but just in case. And so, of course, Marilla was very surprised to see young Anne there. They couldn't send her back right away, so they kept her overnight. And as the story would have it, they did end up giving Anne a home and coming to love her and cherish her, even though she was at times quick-tempered, impulsive, and proud. She was also very spirited, imaginative, and utterly woeful about her red hair. So that was a big part in the story as well. And it just goes through Anne's first few years of living with Matthew and Marilla on Green Gables, going to school, having different relationships in her life with both adults and other kids her age. Her bosom friend, Diana Barry.
They're kindred spirits.
Yes, which is one of my favorite terms. I love thinking of people as kindred spirits. And also her rivalry with a boy 2 years older than her, Gilbert Blythe. So,
sigh.
Yes. Yes, of course. So Anne gets into a lot of interesting situations and has a very flowery way of communicating with other people. She loves story, drama, and I think you guys talked about it a little bit, but I also read that Montgomery used certain parts of herself in the character Anne, which was like her love of nature, theater, and other such things. So it's just a really lovely, feel-good story. And Mikayla's giving me the eye right now.
It's fine.
What's your hot take on Anne of Green Gables, Mikayla?
My hot take is that it's actually not that great of a novel. I didn't read it as a kid, and I think that probably makes a big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Because it's the same reaction that I had when I read Little Women for the first time as an adult, where it's too saccharine for me. Mm-hmm. Like, everything is so sugary sweet. There's no stakes. I'm never, afraid for anybody in the novel. I'm never afraid they're actually going to send her back to the orphanage, even though they go through this whole horrible thing. I was, sweating when I was reading this, because they're like, well, obviously somebody made a mistake, so let's go find out who. And they drag Anne to, this interview to be like, you made a mistake and brought me the wrong kid, and they make Anne go with them. It's awful.
I don't think they were quite sure what trauma was. And abandonment issues they were instilling in her.
Right. So, I don't know, I think it belongs to a very specific time and place in literature, and I don't think it necessarily translates to a modern audience.
I couldn't disagree with you more.
I'm sure, yeah.
This has been a lifelong love of mine. One of the happiest moments as an aunt I had was when I watched Anne of Green Gables with my little niece Larkin for the first time, and she was like, Anne Shirley's like me.
Oh, cute.
You have to admit that's adorable.
I did.
Yeah.
That's very cute.
That was heartwarming. And it definitely is a big part of my childhood. I had the whole box set because there are many books. Because Maud was under contract that if the first book was successful, she had to write sequels, and she eventually got really sick of Anne.
Yeah, didn't she write Anne of Avonlea the following year and it was published?
Yep. So I think there's like 7 Anne books.
So there's 8 altogether, if you include the Blythes Are Quoted, which is a posthumously published. It didn't get published until 2009, but she had written it and then kind of canned it. So 8 altogether if you include those.
Oh,
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's 7 too many.
Wow.
That was harsh.
So, I mean, isn't it even the thing... Okay, you know, like, I don't like Game of Thrones, but I can appreciate that people like it. Do you think it's bad, or are you just being contrary?
Well, I mean, I'm always being contrary. However, I don't actually think it holds up a lot of literary merit for me, although I know that other people see a lot in it. And I do think it's interesting. Maud is the the best-selling Canadian author of all time.
Yep.
Today, and even in her lifetime, and was often dismissed by scholars in the early part of, like, the 1900s because she was a woman and she was writing what they considered children's literature or women's literature. So they didn't really include her in scholarship discussions for a long time. So I think she's overlooked. I just don't like the novel that much.
Fair enough.
That's just me.
Fair enough. Yeah, Anne Green Gables, like I said, was one of my favorite childhood heroines. Like her, and I was also like a Little House on the Prairie fan. Did you like Little House on the Prairie, Mikayla?
Nope. I did.
See, I love that. And Little One. We are different people.
Yep.
Yeah. And with my 2 sisters, like, they also instilled a love of it, and we would watch the 1985 adaptation that we'll talk about later. So that became a big part of my childhood.
Yes. And I'm the same with you, Roxanne. I grew up reading Anne of Green Gables, and I can see your point, Mikayla, in it being something different when you've read it and experienced it through childhood and then read it again in adulthood, because there's just that fondness for that character that I'll always have in my heart. But it makes me think of certain movies that I've watched when I was younger, and then I watched them again as I was older, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Why did I ever like this? And so, yeah, that's an interesting idea that you proposed, but I still feel like I would love Anne, the whole world of Anne, if I hadn't read it as a child. But there's something very comforting to me in the story that there aren't any huge
Stakes.
Yeah, like it's a feel-good book, but there are some exciting parts, you know, Anne almost drowning, Anne coloring her hair green.
She bashed Gilbert Blythe over the head with a slate and broke it because he called her carrots.
That's actually, I tabbed a bunch in my book this time.
Okay.
So I have to read this one part.
Go for it.
Yeah, so basically for people that don't know, it's basically Anne's first week of school, or first day, I think. And Gilbert had been away with a sick relative, so he had been gone for 2 years, and so he was just coming back into the classroom setting as well. But he teased the girls relentlessly, and when she sat down next to Diana, he was whispering carrots at her, and through her temper, she stood up and hit him over the head with the slate. But this is what it says in the book. And then, thwack, Anne had brought her slate down on Gilbert's head and cracked it. Slate, not head, clear across.
I remember, so I listened to this on Audible. It was narrated by Rachel McAdams, a Canadian actress. And I remember when I heard that sentence, slate, not head, I was like, that's just a good, well-written sentence.
It is. I love it
Good job,
so much.
Maud.
Yes.
The only time that I laughed in this entire book, you ready for this? My quote that I enjoyed.
What was it? The end.
No, it was actually at the very beginning, before I had decided that I didn't like it. Their nosy neighbor tells them that they shouldn't get an orphan because orphans poison people or kill their families or like all this weird stuff.
She's gonna set your house on fire.
Exactly. So my favorite quote from the whole book is, "Well, we're not getting a girl," said Marilla, "as if poisoning wells were a purely feminine accomplishment and not to be dreaded in the case of a boy."
Yes. So good.
And that's my favorite line and the only good line. I stopped caring about 2 seconds after that. So.
Oh.
Wow.
I know.
Cool.
Well, and I'm so bummed because the audiobook that I listened to through our Overdrive collection was introduced by Margaret Atwood, who, as you all know, is my favorite author of all time. So I was, like, really excited for this, because I'm like, well, if Peggy likes it, I'm gonna like it.
She's also probably biased, though, because she's Canadian.
I think that's exactly what happened, yeah. I disagree with her for the first and only time in my life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Kristi and I did pick out some of our favorite quotes from the book.
Okay, hit me.
With examples of just things that make me happy. Yeah, listening to this book was like putting like a fuzzy blanket on.
Mm-hmm.
Just felt good.
Yeah, cup of tea in a cozy spot by the fire.
A couple of my favorite quotes are, "Isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find out about? It just makes me feel glad to be alive. It's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half so interesting if we knew all about everything already, would it?" And this next quote I know could be like very basic and you could probably find it on a pillow at TJ Maxx, but I love it. "I'm so glad I live in a world where there are Octobers."
Okay, can I insert in here too? Because that is also one of my favorite quotes. And I have it tabbed in my book as well because there's also more than just that passage. Let me see if I can find it.
As we are talking, I am looking at a framed quote on Kristi's office wall that says, "Tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it yet."
Yeah, so actually that my mom was the one that got me into the Anne of Green Gables story in the 1985 adaptation. And that was something that she always said to me, was that tomorrow's a new day and no mistakes in it yet. And so I have a very fond just place in my heart for that. But back to the October quote. The paragraph goes, "Oh, Marilla," she exclaimed one Saturday morning, coming dancing in with her arms full of gorgeous bows. "I'm so glad I live in a world where there are Octobers. It would be terrible if we just skipped from September to November, wouldn't it? Look at these maple branches. Don't they give you a thrill? Several thrills? I'm going to decorate my room with them." And the reason I wanted to add, in addition to that quote, was that just perfectly sums up what Anne of Green Gables is. The descriptions of things, the way that Anne is just good-natured and looks at things in such a beautiful light is why I love this book.
She's very earnest.
Yes.
Which I like about her. And I think, as we'll see in the adaptations, plain Anne, I think, is really tricky because it is super easy for her to come off as obnoxious and very, like, precocious child actress, like, "Gee, Matthew."
Yes. Yes.
"Aren't you glad you live in a world with Octobers?"
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's really hard to be subtle with her, but when it's done well, it's done really well.
Agreed.
Yeah.
1000%.
And precocity is absolutely the line for Anne's. Like, that's the exact word I was going to use is...
Yes.
Yes.
She is precocious to a fault, but I think it's because she has a good heart that I don't find it annoying. But also, I think I see myself now, even and when I was a kid, as like, "Isn't this great, everyone? Look, like," I tend to get really excited about things, and I share that with Anne.
Yeah.
Mikayla just had a 1,000-yard stare.
No, I just, the person I identify most with in these novels, this will not surprise you at all, is Marilla.
I knew you were going to say that.
So,
I knew you were going to say
100% Marilla, she's me.
And I am Anne.
that. But they both
Makes a lot
love
of
each
sense.
other, so...
Well,
there's
yeah, we
that.
get along real well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not kindred spirits.
No.
No. But I love making a podcast with you.
Me too. Do you guys have-
Mikayla, aren't you glad you live in a world where there are Octobers?
I mean, yeah, I like October. Do you guys have more quotes that you want to
Okay,
read?
one more that
Okay.
I want to put on my wall, because reading this quote after knowing how much Maud struggled with depression, she wrote, I'll do it annoying, "But really, Marilla, one can't stay sad very long in such an interesting world, can one?" So I just ruined the whole point of the quote by saying it like that, but
I do
really,
love
Marilla, one can't stay sad very long in such an interesting world, can one?
You sound about like the narrator who did the version that I listened to.
Oh, God.
Like, she constantly... And I think that's part of the reason I didn't like it so much was because I listened to it, and she had, like, a very, like, sugary Anne voice.
Child actor voice.
And also, when she did Matthew's voice, he constantly says, "well, now," but every time she would say, "well, now." and then say whatever the next thing he was going to say. But, like, that long, drawn-out, well, now.
Mm-hmm.
And I hated it.
And that's precisely why I don't like listening to audiobooks.
I normally love it.
I like creating the voices in my own mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I also read faster than they talk. Or, like, in my mind, I talk faster in my head, if that makes sense. The only audiobook that I truly love and can listen to a million times is the Harry Potter books. It's so good.
The Stephen Fry version.
Is it? I don't know.
There's several different versions.
Okay.
And the Stephen Fry one always cracks me up because there's this whole story, I've probably told you before, about how he couldn't pronounce Harry pocketed it, and he said something mean about J.K. Rowling while she happened to be in the studio, so then she put that quote into every Harry Potter book from then on. So
That is so petty, and I love it.
It's excellent.
I love it too. Yes.
So anyway.
Yes. So another quote that I love is, "True friends are always together in spirit."
No.
And that means more to me now than ever, since 4 years ago I moved from Nebraska to Idaho. And I have someone in my life that's a kindred spirit that I think about every day.
Give her a shout out.
Yes, her name is Brooke. And she actually gave me my very lovely hardcover book, Green Gables, that I cherish.
Aww.
So
Well, shout out to Brooke.
Yes, Brooke is my bosom friend forever.
Oh.
That's sweet.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. Also, as a transplant here, that means a lot. And Kristi is a fellow Midwesterner, so kindred spirits.
Indeed, we are.
Yes.
Yes. Another quote that I have, but I think we should talk a little bit about the background of this quote before we get too far, is talk about a little bit of the romance in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And as a children's novel, you wouldn't really think of it as having a lot of romance, and there isn't, but there's small bits and pieces in there between Anne and her rival Gilbert that would make my heart pitter-patter when I would read certain things and watch the movie. They were off to a really bad start with Anne breaking the slate over Gilbert's head, but Gilbert is immediately transfixed by Anne. He secretly, in my opinion, has that burning love for her, although once that incident happens, Anne wants nothing to do with him, cuts him off completely, even though he tries to apologize, and they just keep getting into some situations together that force them to be in each other's lives, even though Anne acts as though she absolutely hates him. Do you guys want to add anything about that?
I think it's all very convenient, personally. That's all I can say.
Sigh.
Gilbert was definitely, I think, many young girls' first literary crush. I mean, him and Laurie from Little Women, obviously.
Same.
I also don't like that one, so.
But God, they don't get together until the book 4 or something.
Yeah, you really have to grasp at straws when you're hanging on to that Gilbert love in the first book. So one of the times so it was after she broke the slate on his head, and they were playing, I think it was over their lunchtime, which they called dinner, and they were coming back, and even though Anne was with the boys that were coming in late, she was singled out by the teacher, got in trouble for it, and he made her sit next to Gilbert, which was, so awful for Anne. And the boys did not sit with girls. And so, he tried his best to, tell the teacher it wasn't her fault, it was my fault. But anyway, it was sometime after that he had brought her, a little heart that he had made. He left it at her desk, and she took it off and then stomped on it on the ground in 2 pieces, which is hilarious. And then another time in the book that I absolutely love, after Anne had recited on stage, she had a flowery crown on her head, and one of the roses had fallen off on stage, and her best friend Diana Barry witnessed Gilbert taking the rose that had fallen and pinning it to his lapel.
Oh my God.
Which I just thought was so swoon-worthy. And then the other element of that is at the end of the book, Anne, who had received the Avery Scholarship, which was a $250, I believe, scholarship yearly, which I think is a lot back in the
It covered all of her school expenses.
Yeah.
I wish my student loans were like that.
Right. So it was a big deal. She was number 1 at Queens over the whole island, and that was just showed her hard work and dedication. But she ultimately decided to give that up to stay at Green Gables to help Marilla. And so the biggest swoon for me was that Gilbert was already first in line to teach at the school in Avonlea, and he gave up that position so that Anne could take it and stay with Marilla for the next year. And I just absolutely adore that, because it just shows his secret love for her, even though he tries to play it off as no big deal and that they're just friends.
But he's not too cool for school. He loves her.
Yes, he does.
I would love to talk a little bit about how mental illness is portrayed. And if not mental illness, like just also like neurodiversity is portrayed in the book. Like, for instance, Matthew, and I'm playing armchair psychologist, but Matthew clearly has social anxiety, like severe social anxiety. And it's said that Anne is pretty much a portrayal of a girl who has ADHD. And once I heard that from Kristi, yeah, I think absolutely she has ADHD.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
There's a lot of scholarly papers researching Anne as, like, there's sort of like a lane of history looking at how different mental disorders and neurodiversity are portrayed in literature without necessarily having the names for them. And so I think, yeah, Anne's just a really cool example of that. Where it's like, oh yeah, so she talks a lot, she's hyperactive, but they didn't have a word for it. She just get a spanking.
Right, yeah. Or she was viewed as being weird, or often in the book they refer to her as being queer. And it's like, actually, there are reasons that we are the way that we are, and they just, like you said, Roxanne, didn't have a label for it back then. Yeah. And I did, like watching film adaptations that I've watched of Matthew don't really explain, I think, as well what's going on with him, like the book does. He's just petrified of women, even of young girls. And that's why it was so hard to talk to Anne when he first arrived at the train station, because that's just outside of his realm. And he even has a conversation with Anne later in the book about whether he ever had a beau, and he was like, no, not interested, even though Marilla had, which was Gilbert Blythe's father for a short period of time. Yeah, I find Matthew to be so endearing, because you know that he has very much love for his girls, Marilla and Anne, but he just has such a hard time talking to and showing that with other people.
Let's move on to adaptations. So I feel like we've been hinting at a lot of them, but let's go through some of the major ones. I mean, this has been translated into, 35 languages, so there's been a ton of adaptations. The earliest one on film was in 1919, and you can find, if you type 1919 Anne of Green Gables on YouTube, you can find, not the film because it was destroyed, but you can see stills from the film, and she looks very Pollyanna-ish. Pollyanna-ish.
Yeah.
So, Maud hated it, and did you say you have a quote?
Yeah. They set this film in America instead of in Canada, and she said, "I think if I hadn't already known it was from my book that I would never have recognized it. A skunk and an American flag were introduced, both equally unknown in Prince Edward Island. I could have shrieked with rage over the latter. Such crass, blatant Yankeeism."
Love it.
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It is real blasphemy that they said it in America.
Yes.
That's bad.
So much of it is based on Prince Edward Island. They even talk about, like, the red dirt that is on the island, and so much of the description is based on that.
This is why I think it belongs to a particular time and place. Part of the reason.
It's like my dream to go to Prince Edward Island and, like, tour the Anne house and do all of the Anne things. So I hope it's a trip that my mom and I can take together someday.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yes.
I read that in 1920, Maud's uncle demolished her childhood home because he was pissed that so many tourists were stopping by all the time. She was devastated.
Oh my gosh.
Ugh.
Yeah.
She didn't have a great family.
That's great. So the next one, I think, is 1934.
Yeah.
a black and white one, followed by a 1940 And of Windy Poplars. And Lucy Maud still did not appreciate this movie. It's crazy that she was alive for two adaptations. She still didn't like it, but she thought it was 1,000 times better than the 1919 film.
Yeah, have you seen the black and white one?
Mm-mm.
I have not.
You can find it for free on, like, YouTube. I mean, you can find it legally at whatever.
On the webs.
I couldn't finish it. It's so saccharine, and it's very, like, oh, Marilla. I dyed my hair green. Also, the Marilla in the 1934, hashtag not my Marilla. That is not Marilla.
What's wrong with her?
Yeah, do tell.
So Marilla is supposed to be all angles, and like she's supposed to be like very thin and like kind of like I was imagining like kind of bird-like.
Very extreme. So like all of the ants in like James and the Giant Peach, or like
Yes.
anyone who is a mean, bitter old lady. Like,
Yes.
me, I wish. Anyway.
Yeah, so she's like kind of frumpy. She's wearing a really bad wig, first off. Everyone's wearing a bad wig in that movie. I think Maud called this Marilla like Maud of the Big Eyebrows.
Wow.
Or, sorry, she called her Marilla of the Big Eyebrows.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So why did you have to cancel this movie then?
It's just boring. And there's no score. It's just, it's not, she's too precocious and child actor-ish. And another bizarre thing, it says Anne Shirley, played by Anne Shirley. And I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
What?
I was like, did she only get the role because her name was Anne Shirley? It was really bothering me. And then I found on mentalfloss.com that the actress, whose name was Dawn Eveline Perius, actually legally changed her stage name to Anne Shirley and went by that the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, honey, you
Wow.
weren't that great in the role.
Yeah. Yikes.
So that was super weird.
Yeah.
So that brings us to probably the most popular adaptation today, which is the 1985 one, starring, and apparently it's pronounced Megan.
Uh-huh.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Follows.
Yeah.
I think that's one that people of our generation probably have the most love for. It's a good Marilla. It's a good Matthew. It's a really cute Gilbert Blythe.
Jonathan Crombie.
And this Anne isn't too saccharine. She's feisty. Yeah, anything else?
I think it's the most faithful adaptation
Mhm.
of all of the Annes that I saw. And I think that she walks the line between precociousness and too much. Like, she's pretty good. Marilla, I actually thought was, like, spot on. I liked Matthew. So I actually didn't mind this one.
Okay,
That's-
I'll
it's
take
long. It's a mini-series.
Mhm.
So it's, like, 4 hours long. But I actually, of all the Annes, I think that's the best Anne. That's my take.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a hot take. That's
No.
pretty well agreed.
Agreed. Yes. I remember, though, the first time that I had read the book. So I had watched the movie first,
Mhm.
and then my mom had read me the book. But then, like, when I was old enough to actually make the decision of reading the book on my own and rewatching the miniseries, I had just freshly read it, and so as I was watching it, I was super critical, and I'm like, well, that didn't happen like that, and that's all out of order. And then I'm like, okay, calm down. It's
Calm down,
okay.
Kristi.
Like, you know, they have to make it a certain way. But yeah, I got really defensive over like the book versus the movie, and now obviously I love them both very much. But yeah, I do find myself being more critical of movies and television shows that are based on books if I read the book first. And I think a lot of people are probably that way.
Yeah. I definitely had that with The Giver, which is one of my favorite childhood and adulthood books. I love that. And a couple years ago they made a movie, and I think it's absolute trash. But a lot of people liked it. It's got Taylor Swift in it. Haha. We had to mention her. It's been a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't mentioned. Oh, I feel like Taylor Swift would love some Anne Green Gable vibes.
Probably,
Yes.
Yeah.
That reminds me, that whole cottagecore thing is very in right now.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I
Yes.
even cosplayed today to work as Anne Green Gables. I'm wearing like a prairie dress.
And you look so lovely.
You too.
Oh my god, thank you.
And we're having tea, so it all fits in.
Yeah, like my Red Bull is really historically accurate as well. So yeah, I think that's like the most beloved version, and let's talk about now the 2017 Anne with an E, which comes from the quote when she first meets Matthew and Marilla the first night. She says, "Can you call me Cordelia?" And she's like, "Is that your name?" She's like, "Well, no, but it's a lovely name. And if you can't call me Cordelia, can you at least call me Anne with an E?" So she's very particular about that E on the end of her name. And so Anne with an E, I like it. It's very dark. What do you guys think?
I watched the first episode and then quit.
Same. I didn't even make it through the pilot episode. I found the actress that was playing Anne to be too theatrical acting for me. She was too over the top. I just couldn't get into it. And several of my friends have said, just try, because there's been other shows that the first episode is not so great and it takes a little while to get into. And I don't know. It just was not there for me.
I felt the same. On the line of precociousness, she is an 11, right? She turns it up to 11, and I'm annoyed by her. And I also think it feels too modern. It's got the whole opening sequence that feels like all of the other films coming out right now. Like, if you've seen the Emily Dickinson miniseries, it's kind of like that, where it's like just weird jumbled images and like paintery type thing with like a kind of modern song.
Oh, the intro, you mean?
Yeah, it's too modern for me. It doesn't jive with the old school Anne vibe. So,
yeah, I know they definitely were going. I heard something from the director. Like, they definitely were going for like an Anne you'd never seen before.
Yeah,
I didn't mind it. I saw the first season. I'm not going to watch the second season. But what I found was a really interesting take is how much trauma we see Anne's gone through. Like, there are really dark flashbacks to the previous home. So before she came to Green Gables, she had been like lent out as a maid. Yeah, so she basically was just used as like free labor for families before she came there. And in the movie, like, yeah, you see really dark flashbacks of her getting verbally abused, hit, and like really awful things happening. And what bummed me out about that is, like I said, I watched the 1985 version with my niece, and she doesn't like scary things. And it's a bummer because I can't show her Anne with an E probably for, a few more years, but I would have loved to share it with her. But it's like the flashbacks are so quickly interspersed, it'd be hard to like fast forward through them. So that was a bummer that it was for an older audience, but I think that Anne should be for like an everyone movie.
Yes.
It's because it's like a perfect no stakes story that like doesn't stress you out.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, they do talk about a little bit of Anne's past in the first book, as far as like her parents passing away and her moving on to some other foster families before being put into the asylum. Was it Mrs. Hammond's husband was like an alcoholic? One of the
I think it's the
families.
one before
Is
that.
it the one before that? Yeah, but that does bring up a question that I often think about when I think about Anne, is how did she become so wonderful being those circumstances? Like, it gets very much into that nature versus nurture. And I mean, since her parents died when she was 3 months old and she was in either an asylum, which is, basically an orphanage, up until age 11, and then spurts living with those two other families, how did she become Anne?
She's very resilient. I'll give her that.
I see her imagination as her disassociating.
Ooh, yes.
I think that playing armchair psychologist again, that she just disassociated. Like, she can just pretend her way, imagination her way out of like horrible trauma, but just pretending that it's something else.
Yes.
Like,
So
she's like Cassette from Les Mis.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. How about that?
I think a good example is, for instance, she doesn't know if, like, when Matthew comes to pick her up from the train station, she wasn't sure if anyone was going to come get her. If I was 11, I'd be terrified that I wouldn't have anywhere to go for the night. Instead, she's like, oh, it's okay. I just imagined that I would sleep in that cherry tree. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that be lovely to sleep in a cherry tree? I'm like, no, that's horrifying to be an 11-year-old girl at night at a train station.
Yeah, an unknown place.
Yeah, so I think that was just her coping.
That's excellent thought. She also has that imaginary friend that's basically her own reflection that is very sad. But again, I think that's a way for her to talk to somebody of similar interests and be a friend, since she never had one. And you also see that too when she first meets Diana Barry. She's like instant friendship instead of like getting to know the person or whatever. She's like, oh, all of a sudden you're just my bosom friend. And they do thankfully have common interests and get along very well, but it was very instantaneous, like
A very stage 5 clinger
behavior.
But you can't blame her. She clearly has abandonment issues, like, and is desperate for human connection.
Yes. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen like a map of where they live. My mom had given me a book that was like more on the lives and stories behind Anne of Green Gables, and Diana's house was just across the way, so that worked out perfectly for Anne.
Any follow-up thoughts?
Oh yeah, I wanted to follow back to like the romantic, because Anne has a really great quote that I love that says, I wouldn't want to marry anybody who was wicked, but I think I'd like it if he could be wicked and wouldn't. So that might not fit into the storyline at all, but
it's like how a whomp-whomp is a person who could have fun and chooses not to.
Whomp-whomp? Yes.
Yeah, it's a
Please explain.
Yeah, it's this word that my friend made up in college. If somebody was being not fun and like wouldn't go out or something, she'd be like, you are being a whomp-whomp. That is someone who could have fun and chooses not to.
Okay, I love it.
Okay,
though.
so me, again.
You're not a womp-womp.
No, I'm a whomp-whomp.
Are you?
Yeah, I feel fine about it.
So, before we wrap up, we just wanted to talk about kind of a cool sensation, or I don't know what you call it.
It's a phenomenon.
A phenomenon. So, Anne of Green Gables is fantastically popular in Japan, and it has been for a really long time.
Yes.
The reason it's so popular is because in 1939, Hanako Muroka, English translator, so she's Japanese, but she would translate works of fiction into English. During World War II, she was secretly translating this book that was given to her by a missionary, Loretta Shaw, into Japanese. So she was like, during air raids, she would like hide the manuscript with her. If she would have been caught translating Anne of Green Gables into Japanese, she could have been put to death because it was the enemy language.
Wow.
So she was risking death to translate this. After the war, in the 50s, it was finally published, and it was widely distributed to like all of the Allied rebuilding program libraries. And by the 1970s, it became so popular that it became part of Japanese school curriculum. So they love Anne of Green Gables in Japan.
Fascinating.
So cool.
Yeah. All right, Mikayla, so to wrap up, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, we've already talked about a couple. Little Women, obviously, and the Little House in the Big Woods, and that whole Little House in the Big Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I'll also say that you can find the full digital copy of the first edition Anne of Green Gables on Kindred Spaces, which is the L.M. Montgomery Institute at the University of Prince Edward Island's online page. So if you want to see it, it's kind of cool to be able to see it with all the mistakes and things that are still in it. Very cool. There's a recent adaptation called Anna of California, came out in 2015 by Andy Tehran, so that one's okay.
There's also Anne of Manhattan.
Yeah, there's a lot of Annes of somewhere. If you want a movie, I recommend Up, Pixar's Up. It's it's a grumpy old man whose life is changed by a small child. So if you identify with Matthew and Marilla more than you identify with Anne, as some of us do, that's a recommendation. And also A Man Called Ove by Frederick Backman for that exact same reason. I was actually charmed by that one, so there you go.
Can't imagine not being charmed by Anne, but that's fine.
I know.
I was just going to say, in preparing for this episode, the Community Library Network has a couple additional books as well. One of them is an Anne of Green Gables cookbook, which
Cool.
I checked out because I love cookbooks and baking and all of that.
You can make raspberry cordial
Yes.
and biscuits.
Oh, yes. Lots of different things. But the second one that I thought was really excellent was a comic book series. They did an excellent job on the animation of it, and the story is really great, and it's a quick read, but I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Very cool.
If you're interested in Maud, we have a lot of books about her life in the network. You can also check out all of the different adaptations, the movies, and there are a ton that we didn't even mention here at the Community Library Network. I also want to mention that we do have a email address, which is podcast@communitylibrary.net. We'd love to hear your feedback. Please be nice. And let us know where you're writing from, because we're nosy.
So until next time.
We've been Roxanne with an E and Kristi without an E. And Mikayla
With an I. Thanks for joining us.
I am afraid that I'm going to be the first person on your podcast that you're going to have to bleep out, though.
Roxanne's History Corner.
Woo!
Sorry, I'm not up on my
That's
early
right.
1900s drugs.
I did recently use that quote in a newsletter that I sent out for the library, so
And
you're
you
welcome.
didn't even know.
No, I knew.
Oh.
I knew what I was
And
doing.
you knew.
I knew what I was about.
Not raspberry cordial, but maybe some accidental of Marilla's
Currant wine.
currant wine. Would you no longer be a whomp-whomp?
And we still don't have a tagline.